Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OneTAKE Live. Ian Barkin here. I want to first wish you all health and safety. Hope you're doing well wherever you are around the world. Thanks again for joining me and spending time with me. Also, if you do join the live stream, please, in the comment section, enter your name, your location. Actually, you probably don't need to do your name because it says who you are, but your location, and then also be prepared to share questions with us, with me, with my guest as we go. And then also just want to remind in these trying times, many of us find ourselves looking for work. If you are in fact doing so, SYKES is hiring. We're always hiring, but we've got a really strong work at home program. And so please check that out. There are opportunities you'll find at jobs.sykes.com. Again, jobs.sykes.com. Okay, so I have to admit I'm excited, I'm nervous, and I'm kind of geeking out about this one because this topic is something I absolutely love, and I am so thrilled to have the guest that we have on today. So I will introduce him. I'll give a little bit more background. So without further ado, we're joined by Tom Fiddaman. He is the Chief Technology Officer of Ventana Systems. Tom, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And so, Tom, if you bear with me for a second, because I've sort of shared some of this with you, but I'll share why I'm so excited. So I had the privilege of going to a really good business school, MIT Sloan, and stumbled on a topic and a course called System Dynamics. It was taught by Professor John Sturman, and I fell in love with the course. It was amazing. The topic is fascinating. I then went on to take other courses with it. I also took some courses from another professor named Dr. Henry Birdseye Weil, which is a pretty cool name. And so took those courses, had the privilege of meeting a gentleman that Tom's about to speak to us about briefly, and really fell in love with this concept of system dynamics. So there's my lead in. I'm geeking out about this, and I think it's really useful both for businesses in general, and you'll hear why, and then it's especially interesting and useful in this day and age as we look to understand a very complex event that's occurring to every enterprise and every economy around the globe. So there's my geeked out lead in, Tom. Thanks so much for putting up with that. So welcome again. Could you share with the listeners a little bit about your background and your role at Ventana Systems?
Sure. Geeked out is good to me because I was a former engineer. I actually came to System Dynamics by a relatively undistinguished path. I was an undergrad in engineering school, and I wanted a class that met on Tuesdays and Thursdays so I could get a ski pass for Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and System Dynamics fit the bill. And I didn't really distinguish myself in class at first, but after a few months, it started to sink in, and suddenly the world started to make sense to me. So it's the lens through which I see everything, essentially, not just business, but the environment, relationships, all sorts of things. And coronavirus is now one of them. So I am kind of a modeling generalist. So I'm a specialist in simulation modeling and system dynamics technology, and I spend part of my time writing code and things like that. But probably most of my time is more client-focused on solving with models. So we do a mix of things. I tend to do a lot of climate and energy policy. So I helped out with Climate Interactive build a couple of online simulations that have been used by a couple 100,000 people to understand how the climate system works and what it takes to problem. But I've also done things in pharmaceuticals, looking at the role of medication in mental health systems for disadvantaged populations, and modeling supply chain for or ports for a company that made half the fast food bacon in the country, and modeling the logistics of aircraft construction. Looking at how do you get the cost out of the system and make money building airplanes. A lot of different kinds of domains, but the common denominator is always that you just have a big messy problem space, and it's hard to get your arms around it using just words. So we use pictures to try and elicit what's going on in the system, and then turn those pictures into formal models that let you predict with the model what you think is going to happen. And then if that seems crazy, you can fix the model and you can learn from that. And after you do enough refinement, hopefully you have a tool that then lets you make decisions that are, both give you a good outcome and are robust to all the kinds of uncertainty that's out there in the world.
Tremendous. Yeah, your LinkedIn profile, and I love this one-liner, says you love you solving hard problems with dynamic simulations, and so that takes us to, okay. So first of all, I wasn't aware of this. We need to dedicate a whole other show to course selection based on skiing and also bacon. So those are two different topics. We'll discuss at a different time. But so you found system dynamics, found a passion for it. What is system dynamics for our generalist listener? And probably you can't define that without defining also or introducing the man who came up with the concept.
Sure, and I'm going to share my screen so we can see a picture of him.
I'm excited about this. This guy is just super cool. Let's see if the works. Yeah. This
is Jay Forrester. Hopefully you see him as well.
We do.
At the MIT Digital Computer Lab. So he was, as a young man in the 30s, he was at MIT in the servo mechanisms lab. At the onset of World War II, one of the things they did was devise a mechanism that could stabilize a radar dish on a pitching ship. The Admiralty saw that and wanted it in the Pacific right away, so Jay put it in a 250-pound steamer trunk and flew out and installed it on the mast of the Lexington. He was there for some of the key battles in the Pacific, including when the Lexington got torpedoed. And then I guess he got bored and moved on to creating magnetic core memory and the first practical general purpose digital computer that would work for more than 5 minutes at a stretch. That turned into the SAGE air defense system. And then ultimately he paused on all the engineering work and took servo mechanisms theory, engineering control, into a new space. So he started building simulation models of businesses and public policy problems, and built a series of models like industrial dynamics about supply chains, and urban dynamics, which was about the development of Boston and other cities, and world dynamics, which kind of kicked off the limits to growth debate. A lot of these were pretty controversial, but they all had kind of a common element of a common stand turned into a formal model that would let you at least share what your assumptions were, so they could be critiqued and discussed and tested against data. So what we're doing today is really just a continuum of that, and actually a lot of the underlying mathematics is really the same across a lot of disciplines. So models that you see in epidemiology use the same simulation tools and the same mathematics that we use to write a business or a kind of the supply chain for delivering mental health, or things like that. It's kind of all the same underlying toolkit in terms of how you model behavior and what the content area is. So let me show you an actual model and explain sort of how we apply this to the coronavirus problem. And actually, in a sense, this is really mostly coming from epidemiology rather than from kind of the classic home turf of system dynamics. So this is what's called the SEIR model, which stands for susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. Each of the boxes here is an accumulation or a stock of people in a particular state, 17 yet. They recover, and a few unfortunate ones die. So that's the essence of the structure. And of course, there are lots of ways you can elaborate on this. You can have more boxes in the chain. You can explicitly have hospitalization, things like that. Or you can break this out by age classes or by states or cities and have a social network. Or you can take the same idea and turn it into a model with individual agents in it interacting. And that tells you more about how their social network affects what happens. So the key driver here is this red process in the middle. You have infected people. They're out active in the population, assuming they're not in quarantine or self-quarantine. They are infecting other people. Those people are then exposed after 5 or 6 days. They become symptomatic and infectious, not necessarily at the same time. Actually, there's a lot of evidence now showing they become infectious before they're symptomatic, and they become more infectious. So if you go around and around this red loop, every time you traverse the loop, you get more infected people. And there's something you hear about a lot called R0. R0 is called the reproduction ratio, or the base reproduction ratio. And that tells you how fast the amplification. R0 for coronavirus is thought to be maybe, well, there's varying opinions from maybe 2.4 to 3.8 from some scientists in Wuhan. It's an uncertain quantity, but that means that every time you go around this loop, you're somewhere between doubling and quadrupling the number of infected people you have. So that's a problem. That's what leads to exponential growth of the epidemic. There's some things that control it. One natural control is that eventually you run out of susceptible people transmission, but that's not the one we want, because that basically means everyone through the system, and you have a large number of fatalities. But there are other things we can do. One is we can change our behavior to reduce the risk. So that's both hand washing and social distancing. And then we can also use the public health system to try to figure out who these infected or infectious people are and isolate them from the rest of the population so that they're out actively infecting others. But then there are a couple of limitations to that process. One is that the public health capacity is limited. You need both the boots on the ground to get out there and trace who's been in contact with infected people and get them quarantined, and you need tests so you can figure out who's at risk, and had challenges in both those areas. And then another problem that we have is as you start to have a lot of infected people, you have a lot of serious cases, the hospital under strain, and that increases the fatality rate. That's kind of the Italy dynamic, it seems. And of course, another thing contributing to that is that you have healthcare workers getting infected, and then out of the game, that cuts down. So basically, there's some bad vicious cycles that we would like to avoid triggering. That's how you get the emphasis on flattening the curve. It's to avoid those problems. So I'm going to shift to a more complex version of this model now, just to show you how it really works. Any questions, Ian, before I jump ahead? Actually, I have to hide this. I can't get your audio. Okay, I'll just proceed. There we go. Yeah.
FlyChains, or better understand how they work within a dynamic system of partners, et cetera. And you can use these tools to capture all of these different variables that influence or and either contribute to or detract from an outcome that you'd like to achieve. And in this case, the outcome is really fewer fatalities and a point in which we can achieve this herd immunity without overwhelming our healthcare systems. So it's an extraordinary walkthrough and really does well summarize those few key but critical elements, like you said, including social distancing and hand washing. I guess before we get into the more complex model, you've put this together for a particular audience or out of your own intellectual curiosity? What was the sort of the driver behind you and the team at Ventana putting this together?
To this, so I got interested in what's going to happen to my own town, or so I built it actually first for my own county, Galloway in Montana. But the structure's pretty generic. So the things that change as you go from one context to another are the parameters. You know, what's the age structure of the population? Because if you have more old people, you have a higher risk population.
Right.
Things like that. Presumably there's some differences in social behavior and so on. But then lately I've been calibrating this for all of the U.S. states, and we're hoping to do an application for one of the state public health departments. But I'm still also intensely personally interested in this, obviously.
Oh, that makes good sense. Okay, so we're ready. So let's take us up a notch to even higher level of complexity.
And I'm glad you mentioned herd immunity, because it's actually still not on this diagram, but this is a more complex version of the model. You'll notice it has hospitalization and more stages between exposure and infection and illness. But what herd immunity, what we'd really like to have is a vaccine, so we could take the susceptibles and make them immune without ever passing them through this sort of dangerous process. Unfortunately, that's 12 months out potentially. So we have to figure out how to manage this problem in the short run. And of course, it's not just a problem of this disease chain. There's also kind of a cost structure associated with this. So we want to avoid, obviously, sort of the cost on lives, but we also minimize the cost on the economy because there are trade-offs there. It's not just a matter of dollars for people, because those dollars are also feeding people and insulating vulnerable people from problems and things like that. So we'd like to minimize the harm to the system from all sources. That's one of the prongs that we've been pursuing here, but that piece is kind of immature, looking at the economic versus health trade-offs, but it's certainly important. So let me just run this model live quickly. This is a kind of a control panel for calibrating the model against US data. So the blue curve is actual US cases from Johns Hopkins through last week. This is not the most up-to-date, but not too much has changed. So I'm going to turn this on and just show you what it looks like to interact with the model. And actually, I should have mentioned this, but this picture is not just a picture. Underneath every word on the screen, which is probably now too small for most of you to read, is an equation that expresses how the piece works. So the number of infections equals the number of active infected people running around, multiplied by some parameters that are governed by behavior and weather and the number of infected people. So in principle, it's not that different than computing how much interest you're going to get on your bank account next month. You multiply the bank balance times the interest rate. That tells you the interest. You add that to the balance, goes up a little bit, and you repeat. It's just that our bank accounts get pretty pitiful interest rates these days, whereas coronavirus goes at 30% a day, which is kind of mind-bogglingly fast compared to the time scale that organizations usually have to respond to emerging threats. So to calibrate the model, it's sometimes statistically more sophisticated than that, but what I'm doing by hand here, just moving a couple of sliders, is the essence of it. So I'm trying to get the model in the red line to pass through the data, which is the blue line. So here I have one version of it that has about 1,000 cases on March 1st and a R0 or reproductive 3.5, which is on the high side. And maybe the fatality rate's a little bit high there, so I could lower that and I get a better fit to the data. But then it's possible that there are other combinations of parameters that fit well. So a lot of modelers think R0 is more like 2.5. So I'll just lower it to that. Now it doesn't fit the data, but if I change the initial infected population, I'm back to something that looks pretty good. That's changed the timing of events a little bit, so I also have to change what I think the fatality rate is. So now we're back to another pretty decent fit to history. The real challenge here is because there are a whole bunch of biases and lags in the testing process. So it's not enough to just model the number of actual cases. You have to model the reporting process. And there are big uncertainties in that just because of the scarcity of testing and so forth. So we look for triangulation. So we're not just blindly curve fitting. We're also looking at other kinds of information. So it's partly does the model conserve people? Do the units balance? Does it do crazy things if you push it into bizarre conditions? So there's a set of quality tests you can apply, and then you also look for measurements from other sources, other countries or other styles of modeling, or more purely statistical exercises, things like that. So we try to assimilate data from a lot of different parts of the system. One thing we're looking at here, for example, as we're starting to try to think about measuring, are we making a difference, is are there other measures that indicate it besides the case growth and the death rate, which are kind of lagging indicators? And so it's things like cell phone tracking data that people are traveling half as much as they used to, and the smart thermometer data from Kinsa that shows that other anomalous fevers, the flu, sort of fevers from all causes, are down. So those are some kind of corroborating indirect measurements of social distancing that indicate that we're having some effect. So this is, so far, this is an uncontrolled scenario. And what you can see is it's not as bad as Imperial College. It's only 1 million deaths. So I say sort of only as a ghoulish term. So we'd like to do better than that. So what we want is not an uncontrolled scenario, but a controlled scenario. So I'm now going to explore that. Okay, so now we've got two lines that are the same, but I'll start changing things. So the first thing we can do is aggressive social distancing. So I'm going to say, okay, what if we could reduce our contacts? Well, let's reduce them by 50%. So if you look at deaths, and actually I'll make that bigger. You can see that brought us down from 1.1 million, and just incidentally, these numbers are pretty notional in this version of the model. So that cut the problem down by 2/3 already, but we still have a pretty big spike. So for example, here's hospitalization. We flattened the curve quite a bit, but we're still needing 400,000 beds at the peak. The U.S. only has 1 million, so we're taking up practically half the hospital capacity of the country on this one disease. That's probably going to be extremely problematic. So we'd like to do a little better. So one possibility is we just go to really extreme social distancing. Here's more like 80%. That's enough to stop the disease in its tracks. So you now see dramatically reduced deaths, far fewer infections. Here's the infection rate. But that's going to come at a big economic cost. And actually, if we get fatigued by that level of social isolation, what you'll see is compliance will start to taper off after a while. And if that happens, then you actually can get an echo in the infection rate. So here's the first infections followed by hard controls. And then people just get tired and run out of cash, and we're forced to kind of back off on social distancing, and you get a second wave of infections. It's bad because the controls are continuing, but still a bad outcome from a mortality standpoint, and also a bad outcome from the economic standpoint. So what we really need to do is shift some of the heavy lifting from behavior to more of the public health system approach of figuring out who's infected and isolating them. Because if you can figure out who's infected, you can isolate 10%, 1% of the population instead of isolating the entire population. Problem is we're not there yet because we don't have the tests, and we don't have the capacity, we don't have the apps to track people. infected people and so on. We don't have the incentive system that makes it possible for them to stay home for a couple weeks to make sure that they're really have no chance of infecting others. So if we want to shift some of that burden to the other side of the system, we really want to ramp up our effectiveness of quarantine, but be able to find the low-risk people and find the pre-symptomatic people. And if we can find them, test them, then we're much more capable of really wiping this out. And in this case, this is probably a little too optimistic because just with the settings I have here, the isolation process starts too soon, and we just don't have the tests to do it yet. But that's the kind of performance we could get out of the system if we can figure out how to make that transition. And that's certainly the trends that Korea and China have made, at least as far as we can tell. They used extreme social distancing to put on, and were able very quickly to ramp up testing and quarantine in order to keep the lid after that, and then the social controls can be relaxed. I think that's a path that makes it possible for us to hold out until we have a vaccine, or maybe we get lucky and the virus doesn't like summer. There's unfortunately not much evidence of that. And so that's winning the game, and I think it can be done. We just need to be on board with this and get and to the extent that we have short run problems because we're starting late, we also need to have the supply chain for hospital capacity and ventilation and all the other parts of that system humming along smoothly as well. But it's a doable problem without a terrible death toll if we can just get ourselves organized to solve it. Of course, to do that, we'll have a bunch of ripple effects through the economy and our social system. So there'll be other things that we have to solve as well. But I guess I'm optimistic that we can do it.
To tell what is a very complex story, but it boils it down to some pretty crisp and clear and really finite activities that we need to take in parallel. And we need to be doing, as you say, several different things at the same time. The model enables us to see the collective additive impact of that, all for the purpose of buying time. For the scientists to come up with vaccines, to test them appropriately, and then roll them out to a broader community. I'd be chagrined if I didn't mention, you may or may not have known that you gave a shout out to a fellow Sloaney, but the Kinza thermometers were developed by a classmate of mine, great friend Inder Singh, who is the founder of Kinza. So he's getting a lot of great and well-deserved coverage right now, and the role that set of devices is having in giving us more information to try to get ahead of some of the spread just by watching something as simple as temperatures going up in communities across the nation. So shout out to Inder and the Kinza team for doing great work. So Tom, what does this leave us with? I mean, ultimately, it's a very complex model with a lot of complex dynamics. Who do you think needs to see this? Or you mentioned you're starting to work with some folks. Is this something that? And how do we? And I guess this was always Jay Forrester's vision anyway. I mean, I remember when he came to speak to a class that I was lucky enough to see him speak. He spoke a lot about trying to introduce this framework, this way of thinking in primary schools to teach. And as you said, once you're exposed to this concept of how everything is interconnected and how complexity can be distilled like this, you start to see the world through that lens. How do we help the global community see the value in the policies being suggested through a lens that system dynamics gives us?
Pressure out there to make things simple and distill them to sound bites and so on. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot we can do by really opening these models up and making them as transparent as we possibly can. Yeah. Because I think you don't need to sort of be able to do the math of exponentials. Actually, most of the equations here are pretty simple. It's kind of addition, subtraction, multiplication, yeah. Just done over and over again. So it's not that the math it's a limiting factor for building the models, but it's not a limiting factor for understanding them. So I think what we need to do, or a component of what we need to do, is making these things more accessible online. But we're immature in our explanations, and partly we're immature because the disease is growing at 30% per day, and I can't make models better at 30% per day.
Right.
Nobody can. None of our institutions can respond that fast. So the other piece of what we have to do is build capacity, to understand systems just in general, which is what Jay was dedicating himself to in his last couple decades. So if people understand the implications of growth at these phenomenal rates, then they know how to behave around a system that's doing that. And then to some extent, we can kind of train our intuitions to work better in these kinds of situations. And and then also another piece of that is we need tools that are ready to go. We have a big flu modeling capacity at the national labs in the U.S., but a lot of the pandemic modeling capacity was shut down a couple of years ago. So they're now scrambling to get these things back up and running, which is an impossible task in face of the speed with which this has emerged on us.
Right. No, that is all too clear. Quick technical question. If you don't have another slide, it would be lovely to see your face again. And if you do, just let me know and we can go on to that. You referred to something though, Tom, and in the recesses of my mind, I remember some modeling as far as almost disaster recovery, and how nations, how infrastructure should respond in the face of a pandemic. Actually, I think it was SARS or N1H1 or something, but the idea around what you should do to keep just infrastructure running. I think one of the simple conclusions was, and this happened to be, I think, in London, simple conclusion was keep the trains running. Don't stop all infrastructure and all transport, because then it will begin to decay. And then the startup cost will be prohibitive, if not impossible, to get things back online. And you referred to how we need to now model the impact after the effects of COVID-19 on populations. We're shutting down huge percentages of our airline capacity. We're shutting down manufacturing. We're shutting down a lot. What do we do to anticipate and model the startup again, and what we should be doing now from an industry perspective? Right.
So what you want then is a economic model coupled to the epidemic model, where you can turn off a number of jobs or turn off some sectors. So for example, the tourism sector has practically been turned off. Restaurants been decimated as well, and see how that ripples through the economy. There are actually some big models that I think are doing a pretty interesting job of that. Is one REMI. They've done a nice job of trying to take the epidemic and put it into the economic context with those models. But I think there's room for a lot more work on front. And the key, in a sense, is not disrupting the key supply chains of food and healthcare that we need to, and probably electric utilities and the internet as well, that we need to get through the next couple of months with social distancing. Because if those things collapse, then social distancing collapses and you're back to the infection passes through the whole population by way.
Right. No, that's those are the things that a model able to handle that complexity and resurgence of can help guide policy decisions and economic decisions that enterprises make. So who's, I guess, what's next for us, Tom? What other models do we need to be doing, and how do we get the global industry and heck, even financial services industry to start thinking with this long-term system dynamics lens?
So, well, for us at Ventana, we're working on this epidemic model, but the economic coupling is close behind it. We don't have a big detailed economic model that encapsulates all the data, so we're going to create sort of a response surface or something that's calibrated to other models. What you really want is a model that's robust to this kind of shock. In the 80s, there were a bunch of nuclear attack recovery models. GDP would bounce back in a quarter after you killed 100 million Americans, which is just bonkers because of, talk about ripple effects from something like that. As soon as you build a model that had actual physical capital in it, you find out that, once you take out the telecommunications and the energy system, it's kind of game over for a while. So you certainly want models that capture those effects so that you appreciate the consequences of everything you're doing. So that's a key piece of it. But probably the other piece that's important then is looking at this on a more local scale. What does this mean for communities and transfer payments and budgets for entities, kind of all jurisdictions, cities, states, counties, the U.S. I think we're just starting to appreciate those kinds of dynamics. So we'd like to quickly have a top-down view of all those things, but there are other modelers working in those various domains who can kind of come at it bottom up. They have the data and the detail and the understanding, and we somehow need to kind of get all of our heads together to think about this in a coordinated way, as opposed to staying in our own stovepipes and forgetting about the crucial interactions between our pieces.
Right.
So I think that's the big challenge for the modeling community, at least.
Well, and I hope if nothing else from this event, we realize how interconnected absolutely everything is, both globally and locally. And as you mentioned, the supply chain interdependencies. So we need to start thinking in this more comprehensive, holistic way, and we need the tools to help us do that. Any last thoughts, Tom? And we'll wrap up. But this has been absolutely fascinating. I can't thank you enough for sharing your model and for walking us through it.
I guess on a more qualitative note, fourth generation system dynamics, and in between via John Sturman at MIT, and before that Dennis and Dana Meadows at Dartmouth College, who were principles on the limits to growth work, but spent a lot of time writing a column called The Global Citizen, in which she just reflected on kind of the systems behind all sorts of, world events, big and small. And one of the things she always came back to was that even though it's sometimes a scarce commodity, what we really need more than anything else is to treat each other with love. And if we can do that, then everything else kind of flows from that. We can cooperate, we can trust, we can work together to solve our problems. And I think that may be the real key here.
That is a tremendous wrap up. Couldn't agree more. So thank you everybody who contributed and listened. I was so fascinated, I didn't stop to welcome some folks. We have Tracy Kim joined us. Hello, Tracy. Tracy and I went to Sloan together. She was really excited to hear this because she loved system dynamics when she was at school too. Stacy Durant, Connor Sykes, AJ Hanna, Shay Washington, Vince Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. Too many to name, but we'll put this recording up too, so you can share it with others that you think would both be fascinated and find value in hearing Tom walk through a system dynamics model of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I guess to wrap up, a guy who just wanted to find some time to go skiing found a passion in a tremendous science and is able to help the world understand what it's going through right now. So Tom Fiddaman, thank you so much again. I wish you health and safety, and same to all of our listeners. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ian. It's been great.